Hey everybody, welcome back. My name is Matthew. Thank you for joining. Continuing on with our discussion here on worldwide military expenditures for major selected nations around the world, nearly 50 countries here. A couple points, again, just to remind you, this is not to say that the amount of money that a military spends can definitely win a war or predict the outcome of a war. And I think nothing evidences that more than the United States, nearly a $14 trillion military spend over the last 20 years, losing to the Taliban, of which the United States was always an adversary of. But even looking at this military spend here of $4 billion over the last 20 years, that includes the Allied spending, the Allied government of Afghanistan after the major invasions of the early 2000s by the US and some other forces, of course, after 9/11. Nonetheless, in a matter of months, the Taliban took back the country, and you never know. This is just expenditure, okay? These are current figures. They are not adjusting for inflation. It just depends on the exchange rate, of course, to get them back into dollars. We're not looking at GDP. We're not looking at per capita. We're just trying to make a few connections to see where certain military powers stand versus every single crazy story you probably hear every day in the news about war or potential wars, all of which are certainly very serious, but trying to give you some brass tacks data on that. One thing that's going to help for comparison here, as we've looked at the 20-year spend, is let's see now the 10-year spend and see generally how that looks. Are countries simply spending half of what they spent in the last 10 years versus 20 or not? Okay, so I'm going to put that now in green bars up here. All right, so we're going to zoom in a little bit just to understand this a little bit more. Let's go to Korea, from Korea to the US. Now, very briefly, we can say for the US, yes, indeed, it's about half. Little bit more than half, all right? I mean, obviously, if you doubled 7.3 trillion over the last 10 years, you get to a number that's over 14 trillion. The United States did not spend that. And again, I understand the purchasing power of the dollar falls a lot when you look in prior years. So indeed, the United States could have been getting well more for the dollar 20 years ago than it's getting today, for sure. I'm not adjusting for those things. Nonetheless, I'm not doing that for any other country either. United States roughly is on a consistent growth pattern. Okay, they've spent about half in the last 10 years compared to the last 20. Not the case for the next country on the list, China. Okay, obviously serious growth here. This reflects generally when you look at the Chinese economy, it's reflected here in the military. Okay, they're at 2/3 of the 20-year total for the last 10. Okay, so well different than the United States, which is just sort of on an even, continuous military spend, all the while with a declining dollar with inflation. China is well above that. So $2.4 trillion versus $3.3 trillion over 20 years. They spend 2.4 in the last 10. Now that is actually fairly unique. Okay, NATO Western Europe, again, about half. NATO Eastern Europe, again, about half. For Eastern Europe, I also am including two X Factor countries, Turkey and Greece, both of which themselves are kind of perennial adversaries, but they have both been in NATO since the beginning. Both have very high military expenditures to protect their own populace. But they are on the eastern front of NATO if we look at what NATO has historically been at rival with, which has been the Soviet Union and now, of course, Russia. Again, even though NATO has never once threatened to invade Russia, Russia is invading non-NATO members at its border and is threatening to invade other NATO members at its border at the moment. So if you did take off Turkey and Greece, by the way, you're taking off something like 30% of expenditures. So Eastern European NATO membership still struggles, still lags well behind Russia and the UK, and it needs Western European help if something will happen. I think that's quite clear, and if it's not clear, it should be clear. Russia is the one rattling the saber not the other way around. Russia, though, themselves look at their trend, okay, the last 10 years of their military spend versus the last 20. It's actually not as high as China, okay? It's about 60%, meaning this 750 billion over the last 10 years is about 60% of the 20-year spend, okay? So certainly they're increasing more in recent years, like China, but it's not as high as China. Whereas China is even over 2/3 here, right? This is about 70% of 10-year versus 20-year spend. Russia is somewhere about 60%. It is very much possible. Russia is not ever really transparent with their figures, and I'm not sure how much the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is wonderful, has dug into this, but Russia does bury some military items into other pieces of its budget. The sports ministry has even been quoted in certain books. You can read Mark Galeotti's multiple books. I think he's even written about that. So you never know. Certainly the trend is about the 10-year spend is going to be half, a little bit more than half of the 20-year spend, but for in China's case, it's well over 2/3, it's 70%. Okay, so that's the main point. Saudi Arabia as well, they're on a China level. Okay, they're about 70%. India, 65% or so. But the other Western European powers, including Japan, a quote unquote Western power, is not at that level. They're back to about the 50% level. Okay, Germany as well. A little bit over that for Germany. South Korea, again, nations that really understand a threat. You're always going to see more recent spending as the rhetoric increases. So that's the point there. Next thing I want to show here is just the 2023 spend, and that's going to finally get us to the short-term axis. Okay, so it's two different axes here. Just you'll be able to see it in a second, but the long-term, the 10 and the 20-year total spends have been on this left-hand axis. Now we're going to look at the right axis. I'm going to just put the 2023 spends on. Okay. Here we see an interesting thing, particularly with Ukraine. Okay. Ukraine has a big bump. The 2023 spend that Ukraine did on the military, $65 billion. That is 35% of the total amount that they've spent on the military in the last 20 years, and 45% of the last 10 years of the military budget for Ukraine. All right, my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people every day. It's no secret, those that have followed my channel, my positions on this brutal, illegal war that dictator, phony Vladimir Putin has been waging on them really for the last 10 years by slaves, of which 1 in 5 Russians do not even have a toilet. They do not even have indoor plumbing. They have no democracy. They have no freedom. You have to say it again and again and again. Ukrainians have freedom. The Russian oligarchy knows that that is a risk. They know that once their quote unquote Russian brothers start to see the beautiful things that Ukrainians have, they would want that for their own government. So Russia's been in total lockdown ever since Putin came to power. He started to take over the private television networks already in the year 2000. Took Boris Berezovsky's channel, Gusinski's channel. He took Khodorkovsky's Yukos oil, major oil company, of which just hilariously eventually ended up being floated on the London Stock Exchange. Eventually it became Rosneft. So the West has a lot to answer for just letting the blatant theft, lack of democracy go in Russia. And again, that's up to the Russian people to handle. But we were encouraging that. And when I say we, I mean in the West, where you open up the West to these dictators as kids to go to school there. You put their stolen companies on stock exchanges, all the rest. Again, this is not a video about that, but this, anytime we talk about this, it's just extremely important to highlight these basic facts. Ukraine didn't invade anyone since the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians never invaded anyone at any time through all of their history. Of course, they had many skirmishes with the Poles during their fight for freedom and nationhood building, but that was in the context of a very different time in the 19th and 20th century. Post-Soviet Union, Ukraine invaded no one. And that's not the case to say for Russia, which of course invaded Georgia in 2008 and invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014. They did cyber attacks on Estonia, subversion, polonium poisonings on NATO, UK soil. They have no respect for anything that the West puts out. That is Russia. So the point is, Russia is a terrorist state, which I'm going to come back to, and Ukraine, because of this terrorist state, has had to increase their military expenditure. It's just an obscene amount. It's unbelievable to see the 2023 year numbers stacked up against the 10-year spend. All right, that's a 45% ratio. It means in 1 year, in 2023, Ukraine has had to spend almost half of what they spent over a 10-year window. All right, as they try to fight for their country. Hope you're finding these videos creative and to the point when it comes to navigating the rough waters of the financial system. And I'm happy to share with you a platform that can do the same when it comes to getting a loan secured by your Bitcoin, and that is Debify. Debify is a non-custodial, Bitcoin-backed lending platform designed for people who want to borrow against their Bitcoin while maintaining full control. Debify offers institutional-grade liquidity through independent lenders, allowing for high-volume loans of up to 5 years. All transactions are secured by a unique multi-sig escrow system, ensuring that Bitcoin collateral remains safe and transparent. This setup guarantees that your Bitcoin is not rehypothecated, and you keep full visibility and control throughout the loan process. It's perfect for those who value security and transparency while exploring global stablecoin and fiat lending backed by Bitcoin. So head on over to Debify.com today to get started. Clearly, you can see this bump is the 2023 expenditure. And again, we're looking at the right axis here, the short term for the 2023 expenditure. Still in dollar terms, nothing different, but just I'm explaining the percentages, the ratios here. It's a way different thing that Ukraine has had to deal with versus any other military. Okay, you can see a little bit, Germany's getting the picture. They're spending a little bit more. Anytime you see these sort of bumps relative to their peers, at least, they're spending a little bit more. Indians spending a little bit more than France, NATO, Eastern Europe spending a little bit more than Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. That's just what these little bumps signify. But of course, Ukraine way out in front here, spending just a massive $65 billion in 2023, when for 10 years prior, including 2023, they only spent $145 billion. Ukraine invaded no one since the fall of the Soviet Union, and now they're dealing with a terrorist, dictatorial, autocratic state on their borders. Go down the list again here for Eastern European countries, some Western European countries, but again, just to show, and Egypt as well, I'm going to bring them back in the next video. Whether you're looking at 10-year spends, 20-year spends, these are just extremely small. I mean, the Pareto distribution is huge compared to the United States, compared to Western Europe in totality. But look again, Romania, Czechia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia. You're in the tens of billions or billions. And certainly in the last 10 years, you can see that this ratio is a bit higher, like Lithuania, for example. You're getting somewhere in the line of 65%, again, of the 10-year versus the 20-year spend. Okay, so you're getting somewhere close to what China has been doing. Really, but again, these are so small expenditures, obviously. If these countries are threatened or invaded, they will need NATO help. And again, I just remind the viewer that none of these countries have threatened Russia at all. It is Russia threatening to invade for purely dictatorial, maniacal reasons. None of them want to invade Russia. No one cares about Russia. It is a slave state, no democracy, where 1 in 5 people do not have a toilet. So slaves coming to liberate Ukraine, it's a very dicey situation. But again, Ukraine has had to go it alone, mostly during these last 2 years of the full-scale invasion, almost 3 years, I should say. Major ramp up in budget that's going to increase as we go on here, no matter what happens during intermediate term peace talks, let's say. But yeah, it's very serious still for Ukraine. And we're not done, because I want to continue still with this Godzilla versus Bambi theme where I left it in the last video, and we're going to do that next one. So stay tuned for that. Take care.